On a sweltering July afternoon in 1887, in the small town of Copper Ridge, Arizona, old bounty hunter Sam Hawthorne watched through the dusty window of his cabin as children played on the main street. At 52 years old, his calloused hands no longer trembled when holding a gun, but they shook when he held a coffee cup in the morning. He had hung up his pistols 3 years ago after a stray bullet in Tombstone nearly took the life of an innocent girl. Since then, Sam had lived off horse breeding and small repairs in town, trying to forget the 27 men he had sent to the other world. But that afternoon, the shrill whistle of the Union Pacific train echoed through the rocky hills of Copper Ridge, bringing with it something that would make Sam question every day of peace he had earned. The train carried more than just passengers and merchandise. It brought the promise of a new railroad line that would cut through the heart of the town, and with it, the greed of powerful men willing to do anything to control that wealth. Nathaniel Blackwood, the most influential banker in the territory, had arrived from Phoenix with grandiose plans and brutal methods. Blackwood wasn't just a businessman, he was a predator who saw Copper Ridge as his next prey. By his side, like a lethal shadow, walked Sullivan, a gunslinger who collected scars like other men collected coins. Sullivan had a reputation that made even the bravest cowboys cross the street when they saw him approaching. The first victim of Blackwood's ambition was Martha Henderson, a 40-year-old widow who owned the exact plot of land where the railroad station would be built. Martha had refused all purchase offers, not out of greed, but because that land was all that remained of her late husband's memory. It was where he had planted the first tree when they arrived in Arizona, where they had built their dreams with their own hands. Martha Henderson wasn't just a stubborn widow, she was the moral heart of Copper Ridge. When families went through hard times, it was Martha who organized food drives. When children became orphans, she was the one who found loving homes for them. Her small wooden house had become a refuge for anyone who needed help, advice, or simply a hot meal. Sam Hawthorne knew Martha's kindness well. In the first months after his arrival in Copper Ridge, when he was still fighting the nightmares of his life as a bounty hunter, Martha had been one of the few people who didn't judge him for his past. She saw beyond the scars and dark reputation, seeing the tired man who just wanted to find peace. On a moonless night, Sullivan appeared at Martha's door. The gunslinger had spent the entire day drinking at the local tavern, mentally preparing himself for what Blackwood had ordered. Sullivan took no pleasure in killing women, but business was business, and Blackwood paid very well for his services. There was no negotiation, no second chance. When neighbors found the body the next morning, the house was in flames and the property documents had disappeared. The local sheriff, a weak man named Deputy Collins, arrived at the crime scene 2 hours after the fire had been controlled. Collins was a 50-year-old man who had gotten his position more through political connections than competence. He examined the scene for less than 10 minutes before declaring it had been an accident with the fireplace. No one dared contradict him because everyone knew that Collins received a generous monthly payment from Blackwood, the banker. Sam Hawthorne arrived at the scene when the last traces of smoke were still rising from the ruins. He had known Martha since arriving in Copper Ridge 3 years earlier. She mended his torn shirts and always left a slice of apple pie on his windowsill when he returned from long trips to buy horses. Martha represented everything good that still existed in that wild world. Kindness without self-interest, strength without violence, hope without naivety. When Sam saw the charred body of the woman who had become like a sister to him, something inside his chest broke like dry wood. He knelt beside Martha's remains, whispering a prayer he hadn't said in years. In that moment, Sam felt the weight of every life he had taken as a bounty hunter, but he also felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the thirst for justice. He sought out Deputy Collins the next morning, demanding a proper investigation. Collins, nervous and sweating even in the morning cold, stammered excuses about lack of evidence and domestic accidents. The corrupt sheriff avoided Sam's penetrating gaze, nervously shuffling papers on his desk, while inventing increasingly absurd explanations for Martha's death. Sam knew weak men when he saw them, and Collins was as transparent as broken glass. The ex-bounty hunter left the sheriff's office with the certainty that official justice had died along with Martha Henderson. But Sam also knew there were other forms of justice, forms he had practiced for more than 20 years before retiring. That night, Sam visited the tavern where Sullivan usually drank. The gunslinger was there, as always, sitting alone at a table in the darkest corner of the establishment. Sullivan was a tall, thin man with scars that told the story of a violent life. His eyes were cold as winter ice, and he had the habit of cleaning his nails with the tip of a knife while observing other customers. Sam observed Sullivan for more than an hour, studying his movements, his habits, looking for weaknesses. The gunslinger drank cheap whiskey and played cards with other men of dubious reputation, but his eyes were always alert, always searching for potential threats. It was obvious that Sullivan was an experienced professional, someone who had survived so long in that business because he never let his guard down. It was then that the man who would change everything arrived in Copper Ridge. McKenzie disembarked from the afternoon train with a sheriff's star on his chest and a reputation that preceded him like thunder precedes lightning. McKenzie had cleaned up 3 towns in Texas and 2 in New Mexico, always using the same methods: meticulous investigation, unwavering courage, and when necessary, aim that never missed its target. McKenzie was 45 years old, with graying hair and blue eyes that seemed to see through people's lies. He had lost his wife and son in a bandit attack 5 years earlier, and since then had dedicated his life to ensuring that other families wouldn't suffer the same fate. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, even the toughest men paid attention. The new sheriff had been sent by the territorial government after reports about corruption in Copper Ridge reached the capital. McKenzie arrived with specific orders to investigate suspicious activities in the town and restore legal order. He didn't know yet about Martha Henderson's death, but it didn't take long to discover that Copper Ridge had problems much deeper than he had imagined. On his first day in Copper Ridge, McKenzie visited the site where Martha had died. He examined the ruins with the patience of a scientist and the intuition of a predator. McKenzie had investigated hundreds of crimes during his career and knew how to distinguish between a real accident and a disguised murder. He found boot marks that didn't belong to Martha, traces of gunpowder where there shouldn't be any, and signs of struggle that Deputy Collins had forgotten to mention. When McKenzie finished his preliminary investigation, he was certain that Martha Henderson had been murdered, but he also knew he would need more evidence to build a solid case against those responsible. The experienced sheriff had learned that haste was the enemy of justice, and that a poorly constructed case could allow criminals to escape unpunished. That same night, McKenzie knocked on the door of Sam Hawthorne's cabin. The sheriff had done his research on local residents and knew exactly who Sam was and what his reputation was. The 2 men studied each other in silence for long seconds, recognizing in each other the unmistakable mark of those who had faced death and survived to tell the story. McKenzie was direct. He knew who Sam was, knew his reputation as a bounty hunter, and needed his help to discover the truth about Martha Henderson. The sheriff explained that there was clear evidence of murder, but that he needed someone with local knowledge and specific skills to help him identify and capture those responsible. Sam initially refused. He had sworn never to take up arms again, never again to be the instrument of violence that had defined his life for so many years. He explained to McKenzie about the incident in Tombstone, about the girl who almost died because of a stray bullet fired by him, about the nightmares that still tormented him on the quietest nights. But McKenzie wasn't asking him to become a bounty hunter again. He was asking him to be a good man who wouldn't allow injustice to triumph in his own town. The sheriff explained that Martha Henderson had been murdered for refusing to sell her property, and that other residents could suffer the same fate if those responsible weren't stopped. While Sam wrestled with his conscience, Blackwood accelerated his plans. The banker had established his headquarters in Copper Ridge's most luxurious hotel, from where he coordinated his operations with the cold efficiency of a general planning a military campaign. With Martha's property now available through questionable methods, He began pressuring other residents to sell their land for ridiculous prices. Blackwood was a meticulous man who left nothing to chance. He had studied every property in Copper Ridge, identifying exactly which plots he needed for his project. The banker knew about the gold vein running beneath the town, information he had obtained through a corrupt geologist who worked for the railroad company. This discovery transformed Copper Ridge from an ordinary town into a literal gold mine. Those who resisted Blackwood's offers received nighttime visits from Sullivan, who had very persuasive ways of making people change their minds. The gunslinger didn't always need to kill. Sometimes a dead horse in the pasture, a broken window in the middle of the night, or a threat whispered in someone's ear were enough to break the resistance of the most stubborn. The second victim was old Pete Morrison, a retired miner who owned a small lot where Blackwood wanted to build a warehouse. Pete was a proud 60-year-old man who had worked in the silver mines of Colorado before settling in Copper Ridge. He had lost 3 fingers from his left hand in a mining accident, but was still strong enough to work his small property. Pete Morrison wasn't just a stubborn miner. He was a Civil War veteran who had fought at Bull Run and Gettysburg. He had seen men die for principles and wasn't willing to bow before a corrupt banker and his hired gunslinger. When Blackwood made his first offer, Pete politely refused it. When the second offer came accompanied by veiled threats, Pete sent the messenger away with words that couldn't be repeated in church. When Sullivan appeared on Pete's property on a cold August night, the old miner was prepared. Pete had hidden a shotgun behind the door and didn't hesitate to use it when he saw the sinister silhouette of the gunslinger approaching his house. The Civil War veteran knew how to recognize death when it came walking in his direction. The shootout lasted only a few minutes, but was intense enough to wake half the town. Pete Morrison fought like the soldier he had been, using every piece of cover on his property to protect himself from Sullivan's shots. The old miner managed to hit the gunslinger in the shoulder before being struck by a bullet that pierced his chest, penetrating his heart. When silence returned, Pete Morrison was dead on the floor of his own house, still holding the shotgun he had used to defend his property. Sullivan had disappeared into the darkness with a shoulder wound that would remind him of that night for the rest of his life. The gunslinger had underestimated the old veteran's determination and almost paid with his own life for that arrogance. This time, not even Deputy Collins could invent a plausible excuse. 2 deaths in less than a week, both involving people who owned valuable land, were too much to be coincidence. The entire town knew what was happening, but fear was stronger than indignation. Blackwood had made it clear that whoever opposed his plans would suffer the consequences. It was then that Sam Hawthorne made the decision that would change everything. The morning after Pete Morrison's death, he took his pistols from the chest where they had remained stored for 3 years. The weapons felt strange in his hands, like tools from a trade he had tried to forget. But when he placed them in his holster, Sam felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: purpose. Sam's pistols were 2 Colt .45 Peacemakers he had bought in Dodge City at the height of his career as a bounty hunter. The weapons had mother-of-pearl grips and were perfectly balanced for his hand. Sam had modified the triggers for faster response and had practiced with them until they became extensions of his own arms. These pistols had saved his life countless times and had taken the lives of 27 men who chose the path of violence. He sought out McKenzie at the hotel where the sheriff was staying. The 2 men talked for hours, planning a strategy that could expose Blackwood and neutralize Sullivan without causing a bloodbath in the streets of Copper Ridge. McKenzie had legal authority, but needed solid evidence that could be presented in a court. Sam had local knowledge and the skills necessary to obtain that evidence. The plan was risky, but simple. Sam would infiltrate Blackwood's circle, pretending to be interested in selling his property. Meanwhile, McKenzie would investigate the banker's finances, looking for connections to other crimes in other cities. They had 1 week before Blackwood finalized the purchase of all properties necessary for his railroad project. McKenzie also revealed to Sam disturbing information he had discovered about Blackwood. The banker wasn't just an ambitious businessman, he was part of a corruption network that extended throughout the territory. Blackwood had used similar methods in at least 4 other cities, always leaving a trail of suspicious deaths and properties acquired under questionable circumstances. Sam began his act at the local tavern, where Blackwood usually conducted business. The banker was an elegant 45-year-old man with a well-groomed mustache and expensive clothes imported from San Francisco, but his eyes had the coldness of a reptile. Blackwood wore a gold ring with a diamond that had belonged to a miner who mysteriously disappeared in Colorado, and carried a cane with a silver handle that concealed a sharp blade. When Sam approached, pretending to be desperate for money due to invented gambling debts, Blackwood showed immediate interest. The banker had a special talent for identifying vulnerability in people and exploiting it for his own benefit. Sam's property was strategically located and would be valuable for the banker's plans, especially considering the gold vein that ran beneath it. During the negotiations, which extended over several days, Sam managed to overhear revealing conversations. Blackwood wasn't just interested in the railroad. He had discovered evidence of an unexplored gold vein that ran exactly beneath the properties he was acquiring. The railroad project was just a facade for what would be the largest mining operation in the territory, and Blackwood was willing to kill as many people as necessary to keep that secret. Sam also discovered that Blackwood had powerful political connections. The banker had bribed territorial government officials and even some politicians in Washington to ensure his businesses wouldn't be investigated. This corruption network explained how he had managed to operate with impunity for so long, always staying one step ahead of the law. Meanwhile, McKenzie conducted his own investigation. The experienced sheriff had sent telegrams to sheriffs in other cities, investigating Blackwood's past. The responses he received painted a dark picture. The banker had left a trail of suspicious deaths and properties acquired under questionable circumstances in at least 4 different cities. Sullivan was always present when these coincidences happened. McKenzie also discovered that Blackwood had used false identities in some of his previous operations. The man who presented himself as a respectable banker from Phoenix was actually a wanted criminal in 3 states for fraud, extortion, and suspected murder. This information would be crucial for building a solid case against him. The situation became complicated when Sullivan began to suspect Sam's true intentions. The gunslinger had sharp instincts for detecting danger, developed during years of living on the razor's edge between life and death. Something about the ex-bounty hunter's behavior wasn't right. Sam asked too many questions, observed too carefully, and had a posture that Sullivan recognized as that of a disguised predator. Sullivan began following Sam, observing his movements and looking for signs that he was working with the authorities. The gunslinger was patient and meticulous in his surveillance, using techniques he had learned during his years as a manhunter. He noticed that Sam visited McKenzie frequently, always taking care not to be seen, always using different routes. The tension reached its breaking point when Sullivan confronted Sam in an alley behind the tavern on a particularly dark night. The gunslinger was direct in his methods. He simply drew his pistol and pointed it at Sam's chest, demanding that he confess his true intentions. Sullivan was confident he had the advantage of surprise and could eliminate Sam before he could react. But Sullivan had gravely underestimated his opponent's experience. Sam still had the reflexes of a bounty hunter, sharpened by years of life-or-death situations like this. In a fluid movement he had practiced thousands of times, he deflected Sullivan's pistol barrel, disarmed the gunslinger with a precise strike to his wrist, and knocked him unconscious with the butt of his own weapon. The confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds, but was enough to show that Sam Hawthorne hadn't lost any of his lethal skills during his retirement years. When Sullivan awakened, he was tied up and under McKenzie's custody, who had arrived at the scene following the sound of the struggle. When Sullivan fully regained consciousness, he was tied up in the basement of the local church, under McKenzie's vigilant guard. The sheriff had his own methods for making prisoners talk, techniques he had perfected during years dealing with hardened criminals. McKenzie didn't use physical torture, but had an impressive psychological ability to break his prisoners' mental resistance. Sullivan, despite his fearsome reputation, was no match for Mackenzie's relentless determination. The sheriff presented the gunslinger with evidence he had collected, showed him testimonies from other cities where Blackwood had operated, and made it clear that Sullivan would be held accountable for all the crimes he had committed. Within hours, the gunslinger had confessed not only to the murders of Martha Henderson and Pete Morrison, but also to a series of other crimes committed on Blackwood's orders. Sullivan's confession revealed shocking details about Blackwood's operations. The banker didn't just kill to acquire properties, he was also involved in arms smuggling to hostile tribes, money laundering through phantom banks, and even human trafficking across the border with Mexico. Copper Ridge was just the latest of his criminal operations. With Sullivan's confession in hand, McKenzie had enough evidence to arrest Blackwood. But the experienced sheriff knew that capturing the banker wouldn't be simple. Blackwood was an intelligent and cautious man who always kept escape routes prepared and never put himself in situations where he could be easily captured. When Blackwood learned that Sullivan had been captured, he immediately activated his contingency plans. The banker gathered the few loyal men he still had in town, 4 experienced gunslingers he had brought from Phoenix, and entrenched himself in the local bank, transforming the solid stone building into an improvised fortress. Copper Ridge's bank had been built to resist bandit attacks, with thick stone walls and only 2 entrances that could be easily defended. Blackwood had chosen that location strategically, knowing that if he ever needed to make a final stand, the bank would offer the best protection available in town. McKenzie quickly organized a siege of the bank, positioning armed men at all strategic points around the building. The sheriff had managed to recruit some brave citizens from Copper Ridge who were willing to fight for justice, including 2 Civil War veterans and a former cavalry soldier who had served in the Indian Wars. The siege of the bank lasted all night. Blackwood and his men had enough ammunition to resist for days, and the banker was willing to negotiate. He offered an absurd amount of money to Mackenzie and Sam in exchange for his freedom, promising to leave Copper Ridge and never return. The offer was tempting, more money than any sheriff could earn in a lifetime of honest work. When bribery offers didn't work, Blackwood tried blackmail, threatening to reveal compromising secrets about influential political figures who had financed his operations. The banker had documents that could destroy careers and topple governments, and didn't hesitate to use this information as bargaining currency for his freedom. But Mackenzie wasn't a man who made deals with murderers. The sheriff had seen many criminals try to negotiate their way out of justice, and knew that men like Blackwood never kept their promises. At dawn, he gave the banker an ultimatum: unconditional surrender, or the bank would be taken by force. Blackwood chose to fight. The banker knew that if captured alive, he would face the gallows for his crimes. He preferred to die fighting rather than be publicly executed as a common criminal. Blackwood ordered his men to resist to the last man, promising a generous reward for the families of those who died defending him. The final battle was brutal and decisive. Mackenzie and Sam attacked the bank from opposite sides, using their combined experience to overcome Blackwood's men's resistance. The sheriff entered through the main door, using his legal authority to try to minimize violence, while Sam infiltrated through the back of the building, using combat skills he had developed during decades as a bounty hunter. The ex-bounty hunter discovered that his skills hadn't rusted during his retirement years. Every shot found its target, every movement was calculated and precise. Sam fought with the cold efficiency of a professional, but also with the passion of a man seeking justice for the deaths of Martha Henderson and Pete Morrison. The battle intensified when Blackwood's men realized they were being overwhelmed. They fought with the desperation of men who knew there would be no quarter, that capture meant the gallows or life imprisonment. The gunfire echoed through Copper Ridge's streets, waking the entire town and attracting onlookers who watched from a distance. Mackenzie demonstrated why he was considered one of the best sheriffs in the territory. He moved through the bank with the confidence of a man who had faced similar situations dozens of times. The sheriff used every pillar and piece of furniture as cover, methodically advancing toward the office where Blackwood had entrenched himself. One by one, Blackwood's men were neutralized. 2 were killed in the shootout, 1 was seriously wounded and surrendered, and the 4th tried to escape through the back window, only to be captured by Sam, who had anticipated this possibility. In less than an hour, the resistance had been broken, and only Blackwood remained in the bank. The banker made his last play when he realized defeat was inevitable. He tried to use the bank employees as human shields, threatening to kill them if McKenzie and Sam didn't retreat. Blackwood held a pistol against a young female employee's head, shouting impossible demands and increasingly desperate threats. But Blackwood had underestimated the legendary precision of the ex-bounty hunter. Sam had made similar shots dozens of times during his career, situations where a fraction of a second and a millimeter of difference meant the difference between saving an innocent life and causing a tragedy. With a single perfectly calculated shot, Sam neutralized Blackwood without injuring any of the hostages. When the smoke cleared and silence returned to Copper Ridge, Nathaniel Blackwood was dead on the floor of his own bank, surrounded by the falsified documents and fraudulent contracts that represented his unbridled ambition. His men surrendered without further resistance, knowing that without their leader, they had no chance against McKenzie and Sam. The town of Copper Ridge breathed a sigh of relief when news of Blackwood's death spread. Families who had been threatened could finally sleep in peace knowing the terror had ended. Children returned to playing in the streets without fear, and merchants opened their shops with confidence they would no longer be extorted. The stolen properties were returned to their rightful heirs through a meticulous legal process supervised by McKenzie. The sheriff ensured that each family received not only their land back, but also compensation for damages suffered during Blackwood's reign of terror. Documents found in the bank revealed the full extent of the banker's criminal operations. Plans for the railroad were revised to benefit the entire community, not just one greedy man. The discovery of the gold vein brought genuine prosperity to Copper Ridge, but under proper legal supervision that ensured profits were distributed fairly among all residents who had suffered under Blackwood's rule. McKenzie decided to remain in Copper Ridge as permanent sheriff. The town needed someone with his integrity and determination to ensure that men like Blackwood could never again terrorize honest citizens. He established a new standard of law enforcement based on true justice and protection of the most vulnerable. The sheriff also implemented important reforms in the local legal system. He trained honest deputies, established transparent procedures for criminal investigations, and created a communication system with other sheriffs in the territory to share information about fugitive criminals. McKenzie transformed Copper Ridge into a model of fair and efficient law enforcement. Sam Hawthorne returned his pistols to storage, but this time with a clear conscience. He had used his skills to protect the innocent and bring justice for those who couldn't defend themselves. Martha Henderson and Pete Morrison had been avenged, and their deaths were not in vain. The ex-bounty hunter discovered that true peace didn't come from avoiding violence at any cost, but from using his strength only when justice demanded it. Sam also found new purpose in his retired life. He began training young people in town in self-defense and shooting skills, not to create gunslingers, but to ensure honest citizens could protect themselves against future predators. His classes became popular among farmers and merchants who wanted to learn to defend their families and properties. Sullivan was tried and convicted for his crimes in a territorial court that McKenzie had specifically requested to ensure a fair and impartial trial. The gunslinger would spend the rest of his life in Yuma Territorial Prison, paying for every life he had taken in the name of other men's greed. Sullivan had finally found someone faster and more determined than himself. During the trial, Sullivan provided detailed testimony about Blackwood's criminal operations, helping authorities identify other accomplices and recover stolen properties in other cities. His cooperation didn't reduce his sentence, but helped bring justice to other victims of Blackwood's criminal network. The railroad eventually came to Copper Ridge, but in a way that benefited the entire community. The station was built in a location that didn't require the forced removal of any families, and jobs created by the railroad were distributed fairly among local residents. The discovery of the gold vein brought lasting prosperity to the town. Gold mining was conducted responsibly, with environmental and labor regulations that protected both workers and the land. McKenzie personally supervised operations to ensure no outside company could exploit the resources or workers of Copper Ridge, as Blackwood had tried to do. Sam Hawthorne continued breeding horses and doing small repairs, but now with renewed purpose and a community that respected him not just for his past reputation, but for his present actions. He had learned that true peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice, and when injustice threatened his town again, he would be ready to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. The ex-bounty hunter also became a father figure to many orphaned children in town, teaching them not just practical skills, but also solid moral values. Sam discovered that teaching and protecting the next generation was as rewarding as any bounty he had collected during his previous career. The story of Copper Ridge became legend in Arizona territory. It was proof that good men, when united by a common purpose, could defeat any form of corruption or tyranny. It was demonstration that justice, even when delayed, always found a way to prevail against those who chose the path of exploitation and violence. McKenzie and Sam became symbols of hope for other communities facing similar problems. Their actions proved that no matter how powerful the enemy or how desperate the situation seemed, there was always a way to fight for justice and win. Other sheriffs began visiting Copper Ridge to learn from McKenzie's methods. The town established a memorial for Martha Henderson and Pete Morrison, honoring their courage and reminding future generations of the price of freedom and justice. The memorial became a place of reflection, where residents could contemplate the importance of defending moral values, even when it required personal sacrifice. And when the train whistle echoed through the hills of Copper Ridge on hot summer afternoons, it no longer brought the sound of war or greed. It brought the sound of honest progress, shared prosperity, and peace, won through the courage and determination of men who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Sam Hawthorne had sworn peace, and war had indeed come to him, but this time he had fought on the right side for the right reasons, and had won. The old bounty hunter had finally found the redemption he sought, not through fleeing from violence, but through the correct use of his skills in defense of the innocent. The town of Copper Ridge prospered under McKenzie's protection and with Sam Hawthorne's wisdom. They had proven that even in the wild old West, where the law of the strongest often prevailed, men of principle could make a difference and create a better future for all. Their partnership became a model for other frontier communities. Years later, when telling their stories to the town's children, McKenzie and Sam always emphasized that true courage wasn't in never feeling fear, but in doing what was right, despite the fear. They taught that justice wasn't just a pretty word, but something that required action and sacrifice to become reality. And so, when the children of Copper Ridge played in the dusty streets, they did so under the protection of men who had chosen to use their strength to protect, not to oppress. The lesson of Martha Henderson and Pete Morrison had not been forgotten. Their deaths had given birth to a new era of justice and hope in a land that had long known only fear and oppression. The train whistle continued echoing through the hills, but now it was the sound of good triumphing over evil, justice over corruption, and hope over despair. It was the sound of Copper Ridge rising from the ashes of its own tragedy, stronger and more united than ever, a lasting testament that true justice always finds a way to prevail.